Hello, today we are going to be reading Chapter 5 from Heart and Soul. For those of you who are in my homeroom, we had not quite finished reading Chapter 5 yet when we last met, so you can rewatch the whole chapter or you can skip ahead to the part of the chapter that we stopped at if you can remember where that is. Chapter 5 is titled Reconstruction. Okay. Just a couple quick notes before we get started. Reconstruction, is a prefix, means to do again. Construction is to build. So when we're talking about Reconstruction, that is a time after the Civil War in the South when they literally had to reconstruct, rebuild. Okay? So what happened is because most of the fighting was taking place in the South, they had to physically rebuild things. They had houses that were destroyed, fields that were destroyed, towns that were burned down or destroyed, railroad tracks that were ripped up. So they literally had to rebuild things because the fighting took place in and around towns all over the southern part of the United States. The other type of reconstruction or rebuilding they had to do was rebuilding of their social structures and their governments. And what that means is now they had people who were free, who did not have any rights before, who now did have rights because of the amendments to the Constitution. So they had to change their laws, how they did things. They had to change who could run for government, who could become a mayor or a representative or a congressman or anything like that. They had to change the way that they've been doing things for a couple hundred years. So they literally had to rebuild their society. The United States government sent troops to the South to help with Reconstruction to make sure that Southerners were following the laws and to make sure that rioting and different things didn't happen because of all these changes. They also set up an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, literally freedmen, and this was an agency to help the former slaves in their new life because literally the slaves had nothing their whole lives. Nothing belonged to them. They didn't own their own clothes. Those were given to them by the master. They didn't own their own homes. Those were given to them by the master. They didn't own their own lives. So they had no resources, really, after they were set free. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was helping with that. They had no education. They weren't allowed to read and write, although some of them did learn on their own. And also sometimes the Freedmen's Bureau would help them find family members who might have been sold away to a different plantation in the South. They weren't always successful, but sometimes they were able to reunite families. So this chapter starts with a quote. It says, "All men are created equal, says the great declaration, and now a great act attests to this veridity." Charles Sumner, U.S. Senator of Massachusetts. And here's the picture. And again, the quality is not that great. And there's a lot of glare, but you kind of see that. You can see that it's interesting because you have the older gentleman in the front. You'll notice their clothes are better than the clothes of the slaves were on the other pages that we looked at. So they're obviously, according to the painting at least, doing a little bit better. Their clothes are the clothes of free people as opposed to the clothes of slaves. And in his lap, he's holding a book. And the title of the picture says, "A young woman teaches her father how to read." So the older generation would not have had access to education. So now they're literally learning these things that now we learn as children. So that kind of also shows a new part of his freedom, the fact that he's reading and that she's able to teach him, because it would have been illegal to teach him to read before. But you still have down here these old things that remind us of slavery. You have the basket with the cotton in it. You have the carding to pull. We usually seen it used for wool around here, but I guess you could use it for cotton to pull seeds out. So you still have those reminders of slavery, even though in the picture they look more like freed people. So it says, when the slaves were set free, they didn't have nothing, and the old masters didn't give them nothing. All of those folks had a mighty hard time. They had to start from scratch. In slavery times, it was against the law for most black folks to own property, to vote, or to read. All of a sudden, we had to find a way to make it on our own. A few politicians had the bright idea that black people should be sent back to Africa. All 4 million of us. President Lincoln even seriously considered the idea before the end of the war. Even though some black folks made the trip, there was no way the government would pay to send all those black people across the ocean. Besides, we didn't know Africa any more than we knew the south of France. We were born and raised in America. We were Americans by right, and America is where we would stay. Southern white folk had to start over too. Much of the South was destroyed by the war. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were burned, abandoned, and looted by the soldiers. The great wealth of the proud South was gone. Deserted Southern properties were given away, and the Confederate dollar wasn't worth a cup of red Georgia clay. Young folks used to dig that money out of the garbage and play with it. So when the Confederate States separated from the United States during the war, not only did they have their own government, but they had their own money. But now that they lost and they're part of the United States again, all their money is useless. So all of these people who used Confederate money, now that money wasn't worth anything. Here we have a picture of freedmen. So this would be a former slave family. These pictures after the end of slavery were actually pretty popular, and they're in a lot of books showing these slave families lined up outside of their former cabins in different places. Okay, we had another picture here, which is interesting because this picture kind of almost still looks a little bit like what we would imagine the slavery pictures look like, because you have the African-American man here carrying the big basket of cotton. And you have in the background people working in the fields. So that is kind of reminiscent or reminds us of slavery. I'm sorry, I just have to shut off some stuff because it looks like my camera's working slowly. Okay, hopefully that helps. All right, so free times, but he still looks kind of almost like we would imagine work happening in slave times. We're going to find out why. It says, to help Southerners and freed slaves get on their feet, the government planned to rebuild the South with a series of acts called Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was also the name of new laws that they were going to try to make to help people out. The Freedmen's Bureau, which oversaw Reconstruction efforts, gave a few former slaves each about 40 acres of deserted land to cultivate, which means to grow, and live on. Problem was, no one told the freedmen that the land was already owned by someone else. When the true owner of the land came back after the war, President Johnson ordered the free slaves to give back the land. So they took the land away from the plantation owners, and then after President Lincoln was assassinated and died, Andrew Johnson took over, and he basically said that they had to give the land back to the people who owned it, even though the people who owned it were slave owners. So they got land for a little bit and then were ordered to give it back. Some black folks moved west to claim land and start over, or up north to work in cities. Most stayed, and like Pap, went to work for their old masters as sharecroppers. So this would be a sharecropper. Sharecropping was an arrangement where workers would split the profit of a crop with the owner of the land. Old master paid for the seeds, supplies, equipment, and living expenses, and told Pap he had to pay him back for his share of the expenses at the end of the year. After Pap settled his debt to the owner, he'd get the rest of the money owed him for the crop. It sounded like a fair deal, but old master was a crook. When he and Pap settled at the end of the year, he always found a way not to pay Pap. He subtracted the cost of the seed, food, housing, and such from what he owed Pap, padding it here and there, figuring and figuring until it ended up with Pap owing him. Even if he wanted to, Pap couldn't say a word. The unwritten but well understood rule was never contradict a white person no matter what. Okay, so a couple things happening here. The sharecropping, basically, they didn't own their own land and they couldn't be slaves anymore. But what former owners of the land said is, well, hey, we'll let you work this land. We'll buy the seeds. We'll buy the farm equipment. We'll even give you a house to stay in. And when you sell what you grew, like cotton, which is what they grew during slavery times, when you sell that, you keep part of the money, and then you pay me back the part of the money that you owe me for buying you your seeds and everything else, which sounded good, But what ended up happening is they would charge too much, or they would have a store where the sharecroppers would have to go to buy things that belonged to the owner, and they would charge a lot for things. So basically what would happen is at the end of the year, they charged them so much money that when they sold their crop, they really didn't have any money left for themselves. So it was pretty much almost like being a slave. And the other thing, the well understood rule was, even though they were set free, there were lots of rules about what you could do, how you could speak to a white person, even if they weren't real rules that they wrote down on paper. They were kind of things that they understood that you weren't allowed to do. And you could get hurt, not necessarily in trouble because you're breaking the law, but hurt by people who didn't like what you were doing. So, the unwritten but well understood rule was never contradict a white person no matter what. That was reason enough to find yourself strung up from a tree. The best Pap could do was to try to make it back next year, but he never did, honey. Sharecropping was a sneaky way of keeping black folks in the fields without having to pay them, which wasn't much different from slavery. With the end of slavery, millions of former slaves finally had the right to learn to read, write, and figure. So figure means to do math. We talked about that in class. The Freedmen's Bureau helped set up and oversee free public schools and colleges around the South. Scores, which means lots, scores of Northern teachers flooded down to teach all the newly freed slaves and poor white folks who weren't able to go to school before the war. Black men also gained the right to vote, and with it they put some of our own folks in office, even send a few to the House of Representatives. There were very big steps, but our progress didn't come without a price. Time after time, the time after the war was terrible for the black folks. Even though we couldn't vote and go to school, most of us were very poor and illiterate. Illiterate means you don't know how to read or write. Union soldiers occupied southern towns to keep the peace, but didn't do much to protect black folks from new groups of mean whites like the Ku Klux Klan who threatened us all year long. Okay, so this burning cross, we'll learn a little bit more about that, but that was a sign that they would put on people's yards as a warning for the black folks in the South, for them to stay in their place, which means to not try to be as good as everybody else. Sorry, the video's slowing down again. Okay. To stop black folks from voting, Klansmen marched in front of their homes wearing white sheets over their heads, shooting out the windows and burning homes to the ground, or worse, dragging black folks out of their homes to lynch them. The law didn't do a thing to stop it. Shoot, some of the men wearing the sheets were lawmen. It was their way of keeping us in our place, whatever that was supposed to be. They couldn't stand to see us trying to be equal to whites. They were convinced that they were somehow superior to black people. My grandmother used to call it the sickness. Whatever it was just plain mean, honey. Lord knows how those folks could fix it in their minds to do the things that they did to us back then. It was a miracle we made it through. After a while, the government seemed to just give up on Reconstruction. Federal troops were sent back home, and state governments wrote new laws called Jim Crow laws that divided everything by race. Restaurants, libraries, theaters, schools, markets, drinking fountains, you name it. There were now 2 Americas, one white and one black. So they worked to keep everything separate. The South slowly fell backward into something that looked a lot like slavery. Sharecroppers were stuck in the fields in debt to landowners. Black people lived in fear of violence, and the vote was pushed out of reach with poll taxes, which people had to pay in order to vote, and which were too high for most black folks. So poll taxes was one way that Southerners were able to get around the laws stating that black folks were supposed to have the right to vote. What they would do is, knowing that they didn't have a lot of money, they would say, yes, you have the right to vote, but you need to pay a tax. Knowing that most of the African Americans in the South didn't have the money to pay the tax. or sometimes they would do a literacy test. Literacy, again, means can you read and write? So what they would do is they would make them pass a test in order to vote, knowing that the former slaves were never allowed to be educated and therefore wouldn't pass the test. So these were all ways around them, allowing them to be able to vote like they were supposed to be allowed to. New laws, like the Grandfather Clause, said only people whose grandfathers had voted in prior elections could vote, which was obviously made it impossible for black folks to vote because their grandfathers would have been slaves and didn't have the right to vote. The North had won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction.